Imagine uncovering a document that holds a startling revelation when capable of challenging centuries-old depictions of one of history's most iconic figures, Jesus of Nazareth. What if there existed a letter written by none other than Pontius Pilate himself? A letter that didn't just talk about the political turmoil of Judea, but provided a detailed account of Jesus's physical appearance. What if there was a letter offering precise descriptions of Jesus's skin color, facial features, and demeanor? In a world where ancient art and historical records often conflict, could this letter be the missing piece of a 2,000-year-old puzzle? The familiar image of Jesus with serene expression and Eurocentric features might not align with historical reality. Archaeological discoveries and ancient texts suggest contradictions. Was Jesus really as we've been taught to imagine him? If this letter from Pontius Pilate, the man who sentenced Jesus to death, is genuine, it might hold secrets that challenge everything we think we know. Pilate's letter, written to Emperor Tiberius, is not just a political report. It is a first-hand account that dives into Jesus's identity, his teachings, and the influence he wielded. Could this document provide a clearer picture of his true appearance and role in history? Pilate begins by describing Judea as a region on the edge of rebellion. Political tensions ran high, but what made it unique was its deep spiritual fervor. He portrays Jerusalem as a place where every decision carried the risk of igniting chaos. Then comes a question worth asking: who really held the power? Pilate paints the high priests as more than religious leaders. He describes them as cunning manipulators, arrogant yet fearful, balancing control over the masses while negotiating with Rome. Pilate viewed them with suspicion, sensing they feared losing their influence under his rule. In the midst of this, murmurs about Jesus of Nazareth began to reach Pilate. At first, he dismissed the rumors as mere noise about another preacher, but soon, Jesus caught his attention. Why? Because unlike others, Jesus was reportedly sympathetic to Romans, a rare stance in a region deeply hostile to Roman authority. This led Pilate to act. He sent agents to investigate Jesus. Who was this man? Was he a political threat or something entirely different? As Pilate dug deeper, he began to unravel the mystery of a figure who had captivated the people and unnerved the high priests. What Pilate heard back about Jesus was far from what he expected. This was no typical troublemaker stirring up rebellion. Instead, Pilate's agents described a man whose teachings focused on love, humility, and a kingdom that was not of this world. Jesus wasn't rallying people for insurrection. He was talking about inner transformation and a profound understanding of authority. This unexpected portrayal piqued Pilate's curiosity. What kind of man could inspire both reverence and fear without lifting a sword or raising his voice? Pilate's interest turned personal. He decided he needed to see this enigmatic figure for himself, a decision that would mark a turning point in his life and governorship. The first time Pilate saw Jesus, he was taken aback. Here was a man who appeared unimposing, even humble, yet his presence commanded attention and respect. Pilate's account hints at his surprise, even confusion. How could someone so seemingly gentle spark so much hysteria? This initial encounter began a complicated relationship between Pilate and Jesus, one that went beyond politics or rebellion. In his letter, Pilate described Jesus as having an aura that was difficult to ignore. His teachings didn't challenge Roman rule directly, but instead offered a vision of peace, compassion, and personal transformation. This approach made Jesus stand out, even among the most unconventional preachers. As unrest in Jerusalem continued to simmer, Pilate received more reports about Jesus. Roman informants and local officers noted his growing influence. But instead of fiery speeches or calls for revolt, Jesus used parables to convey profound truths. Pilate found it intriguing that Jesus's following wasn't limited to any one group. Commoners, Roman sympathizers, and even some Jewish elites listened to him. What kind of teacher could cross such rigid societal lines in a divided city like Jerusalem? Pilate wanted answers. He ordered his aides to gather more detailed accounts, and even had his secretary transcribe Jesus's teachings. The reports painted a picture of a man who spoke with calm authority and magnetic presence. When Pilate finally saw Jesus speaking to a crowd near the Roman garrison, He was struck by both his demeanor and his physical presence. Pilate's letter describes Jesus as having fair skin, long hair that framed his face, and an expression that was both humble and commanding. Yet it wasn't just his appearance that left an impression, it was his voice. Jesus spoke softly, without the fiery tone typical of agitators, yet every person in the crowd seemed captivated by his words. Pilate observed how Jesus's messages of love, forgiveness, and humility resonated deeply. Even Pilate's own aides seemed taken by the preacher, which unsettled Pilate more than he cared to admit. As Pilate sought to understand Jesus further, he realized the challenge before him. Jesus didn't fit the mold of a revolutionary, but his growing influence unnerved the high priests, who saw him as a threat to their authority. Pilate was now caught in a delicate situation. Should he intervene and risk unnecessary conflict, or let things unfold naturally, knowing the religious leaders were growing increasingly hostile? Ultimately, Pilate decided on a bold step: to arrange a private meeting with Jesus. This encounter would set in motion a series of events that would alter the course of history forever. When Pilate summoned Jesus to the palace, he wasn't prepared for the profound impact their meeting would have on him. Pilate's letter recounts the moment Jesus arrived, calm, unassuming, and completely devoid of fear. Pilate was struck by the preacher's piercing yet kind eyes, which seemed to hold a quiet confidence that unsettled him. What kind of man stands so composed in the face of Roman power? Pilate began their conversation with standard questions about Jesus' teachings and the swelling crowds that followed him. But instead of political slogans or fiery rhetoric, Jesus spoke of love, human nature, and the transformative power of forgiveness. Pilate found himself drawn into a dialogue that felt more like a philosophical discussion than an interrogation. The tension between Pilate's duty and personal convictions grew when he warned Jesus about the growing hostility among the Jewish leaders. Pilate urged him to tread carefully, cautioning against provocative public addresses. Yet, Jesus remained unfazed. He thanked Pilate for his concern, but showed no fear or hesitation about the dangers ahead. Pilate couldn't shake the unease that came with this response. Was this peace a sign of wisdom, or an acceptance of an inevitable fate? As the days passed, the situation in Jerusalem became more volatile. Pilate's efforts to maintain order were met with growing resistance, particularly from the Pharisees and high priests. They viewed Jesus as a direct threat, not only to their authority, but to the entire religious structure they upheld. Despite their hostility, Jesus continued teaching, drawing even larger crowds each day. Pilate's letter reveals his internal struggle during this time. He saw Jesus as a man of peace, not a revolutionary, yet he couldn't ignore the pressure from the Jewish leaders. Behind the scenes, the high priests were leveraging the threat of rebellion to force Pilate's hand, insinuating that failure to act against Jesus would undermine Pilate's authority in the eyes of Rome. How could Pilate protect an innocent man without jeopardizing his governorship? The tipping point came unexpectedly on the eve of the Passover festival. Pilate was awoken by guards with urgent news: Jesus had been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, betrayed by one of his own disciples. The high priests wasted no time, convening a council and declaring Jesus guilty of blasphemy. Pilate's letter vividly describes the chaotic early hours following Jesus' arrest. The Jewish authorities accused him of claiming to be the Son of God, a charge that was both religiously offensive and politically dangerous. Pilate knew the high priests were seeking a death sentence. They couldn't impose themselves. They needed Rome's legal authority to carry it out, and they were determined to use Pilate to achieve their goal. Would Pilate give in to their demands, or would he risk defying them to save a man he knew was innocent? The crossroads of power and fate. The pressure was mounting. Pilate's letter reveals a growing suspicion that the high priests were more interested in preserving their own power than in upholding religious purity. They wanted Jesus gone, and Pilate was the key to making it happen. But how could Pilate justify executing an innocent man for blasphemy alone, especially when his instincts told him Jesus was no threat to Roman authority? Was it possible that the entire political system, the religious hierarchy, and even Pilate's own position were being manipulated for the sake of power? What could Pilate do in the face of such immense political and social pressure? Pilate questioned Jesus directly, asking if he claimed to be a king, hoping to find evidence of a political rebellion that would justify Roman intervention. But Jesus' cryptic response, "My kingdom is not of this world," left Pilate more conflicted than ever. Pilate had been expecting a direct political answer, a reason to condemn Jesus. But Jesus' words defied everything Pilate had been trained to recognize as a threat. There was no clear rebellion, no justification for execution, and yet the high priests were relentless in their pursuit. Pilate found himself facing a dilemma. He could not find a rational reason to condemn Jesus, but he was under intense pressure to deliver the result the high priests demanded. What was Pilate supposed to do when the lines between right and wrong became blurred? Feeling trapped, Pilate attempted to shift the responsibility by sending Jesus to Herod Antipas, hoping the local ruler might make the decision for him. Pilate's mind raced as he desperately tried to find a way out of the situation, hoping Herod would take charge and release him from the burden. But Herod's mocking treatment of Jesus only returned him to Pilate without a resolution, intensifying Pilate's sense of helplessness. Could Pilate avoid making the decision he dreaded? Could he escape this moment that seemed to demand a choice he could not fully embrace? No, the weight of responsibility was on him, and it was clear that whatever happened, he would be forced to act. Outside, the crowd had gathered, demanding Jesus' death, their voices growing louder as the high priest stirred them into a frenzy. Pilate tried to appeal to the crowd's tradition, offering to release Jesus during Passover, as was customary, but the high priests had already manipulated the mob. They didn't want mercy, they wanted Jesus' blood. They demanded the release of Barabbas, a convicted criminal, instead. Pilate's attempt to play to the crowd's sense of justice backfired, and the situation spiraled out of control. Pilate found himself cornered, and the high priests had him right where they wanted him. The religious leaders threatened to report him to Rome, accusing him of disloyalty to the emperor if he released Jesus. The stakes had never been higher, and Pilate's position was now at risk. How could Pilate preserve his position while avoiding an unjust execution? In one final attempt to satisfy the crowd and avoid outright execution, Pilate ordered Jesus to be scourged, hoping the brutal beating would appease them. He watched as Jesus was publicly beaten, his body bloodied and broken, but the crowd remained unrelenting in their demands for crucifixion. Pilate knew that no matter what he did, nothing short of Jesus' death would quiet the storm. The crowd's bloodlust had reached a fever pitch, and Pilate's options were slipping away, one by one. With no way out, Pilate turned to a symbolic gesture, an act that might absolve him in the eyes of the people. He called for a basin of water and, in front of the crowd, washed his hands, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood." It was an attempt to absolve himself of responsibility for what he knew was an unjust act. Yet, Pilate was keenly aware that this gesture would not undo the guilt he felt for condemning an innocent man to die. Could a simple gesture truly absolve him, or was it just a feeble attempt to clear his conscience? As Pilate handed Jesus over to be crucified, his letter describes a deep sense of resignation. The air was thick with tension, the cries of the crowd echoing in his mind as he retreated to his quarters. He tried to block out the sounds, but the knowledge that he had been powerless to stop the inevitable weighed on him heavily. Pilate had done everything within his authority to save Jesus, yet the forces against him were too great, and in the end, the outcome seemed unavoidable. He realized that he had been swept up in a tide of events much larger than he could control. Was this simply about power and politics, or was something much deeper at play? Reflecting on the events, Pilate couldn't shake the feeling that he had been caught in the middle of something far greater than political maneuvering. There was something extraordinary about this man from Nazareth, something Pilate could not fully comprehend. The world seemed to hold its breath after Jesus' execution. According to accounts, the skies darkened unnaturally, and the earth quaked as if creation itself mourned his death. The temple curtain, a symbol of separation between the divine and humanity, was torn in two, as though unseen hands had ripped it apart in protest. Whispers spread quickly through the streets of Jerusalem. Some called it coincidence, others spoke of divine judgment. Could these events really be dismissed as mere natural phenomena, Or was the universe bearing witness to something extraordinary? In the days that followed, a strange mix of fear and hope rippled through the people. Jesus' followers scattered, their dreams shattered, yet rumors of an empty tomb began to surface. Could it be true? Had the man who spoke of a kingdom not of this world somehow defied death itself? For those watching the events unfold, one question loomed larger than any other. Was this the end of a story, or just the beginning?